You know, when I first came to BC, I was just a young pup of a dumpling, fresh out of Dumpling University. Thought I knew everything. Vancouver Island was a different world back then. For one thing, there was lots of old growth forest, huge trees, gone now. And there were thousands of miles of old logging road that led way back up into the mountains. You could drive off and head up into places where nobody would ever find you. And that was back in the days before global warming, when it still used to snow here. Now, when the days get short and the lakes turn cold, the wily bass get sluggish and then they hibernate for winter. There's not much left to live for if you're a topwater bass fisherman. So back in the early days, when summer ended and the topwater bite fizzled out, I'd buy a big box of donuts and drive my Volvo way up into the mountains to the end of some god-forsaken spur road up near the tree line. I'd drive up there right before the first big snowstorm. And then I'd curl up in my sleeping bag, munch a few donuts and doze off, and by morning the whole car would be buried in snow. So I would just basically hibernate up there all winter. Maybe wake up once in a while and nibble another donut, and then go back to sleep for another month or two. And the next thing you know, the snow's melting off and spring is on the way, and you can drive back down the mountain and get ready to go bass fishing again. But most of those old roads are gone now, deactivated by the government and the big logging companies. There's only a few main roads left where the public is even allowed to go, and somebody would boot you out right away if you ever tried to hibernate on one of those. And with global warming, we don't get much snow in winter anymore, so hibernation's not really an option anymore. Which begs the question, what the heck can you do in winter when the bass aren't biting? And we're going to try to answer that question on this episode of the Basstravaganza. The fish we're going to target this week are very different from bass. Bass aren't native to BC. They were brought here in 1902 by the Federal Dominion of Fisheries from the Bay of Quinte in Lake Ontario. They were introduced into a number of lakes in southern BC, southern Vancouver Island. And other than a few idiot bass fishermen, nobody would miss them if they were all gone tomorrow. But they'll never disappear. They're like aquatic rats or cockroaches. Once they get into an ecosystem, there's often no human way to get them out. They're a tough fish as a species, and they're also tough as individuals. They can handle a lot of banging and bouncing around in a boat, and they can be held out of water for a long time. Check out this largemouth bass I caught at Vassou Lake. It nearly had its backbone severed, maybe by an eagle or maybe a boat propeller. No problem, it's still roadworthy and still driving around like an old dented Volvo. This week, we're going after wild indigenous fish. Fish that have to be treated differently than bass. And the remnant populations of fish runs that have been almost exterminated by logging and commercial fishing. Relics from before the day when our coastal streams were trashed by clear-cut logging. The fish that appear on this video might be extinct before the children and the grandchildren of people watching it are old enough to fish the places where they used to live. And we don't want to promote this extinction, so we want to be extra careful about releasing any fish we might catch without doing any harm. The species we're chasing is named Oncorhynchus mykiss. Most people know it as the rainbow trout. They're native to almost every watershed in BC. The province of BC grows them in hatcheries, and they plant millions of these hatchery frankenfish into BC lakes every year. We're not after the hatchery fish. We're after wild rainbows that hatched in a BC river and then swam down to the ocean and roamed all over the North Pacific. We'll be trying to intercept them when they return, when they're called steelhead. We're not just trying to catch them, but most important, to release them without causing them any injury or doing any serious damage to their happy lives. Now, we don't need to spend a lot of money to catch these metalheads. I mean, if they've got a head made out of steel, they're not very smart, right? But we have to spend it wisely. We're going to start out by fishing in lakes where few people fish for steelhead. But we are never going to use triple hooks like we do for bass. Only single barbless. You can either bend the barb back with pliers, or as I do often, I'll take my little Dremel grinder and I just grinder that barb right off smooth. There's only really one important requirement in the way of a reel. Any basic reel will do as long as it has a good drag. These fish are going to be burning 10-pound line off this reel so fast you won't believe it. So you've got to have your drag set right. If you can't do this with your rod, you have to reset the drag. If your drag isn't set right, they'll break off 10-pound line, and they'll break off 20-pound line. Now, rookies at this game might also want to bring along a little extinguisher in case your reel catches on fire from the friction of your screaming drag, and maybe a few band-aids to paste over your busted knuckles too. The third thing, and most important, you'll need a good net. The best way to land steelhead is by leading them up onto a beach, but I will be fishing in a pontoon boat in a lake surrounded by old-growth forest. There is no beach, and sharing a pontoon boat with a steelhead is like sharing a tent with a wolverine. Only bad things can happen. So I will be using a net. If there's only one high-quality item in your entire collection of fishing gear, it should be this. Notice that this is a big, strong net, and it has very soft, smooth mesh. Nets with hard mesh, especially nets with knots in the mesh, like these cheap little nets here, they're fine for bass or for catching trout that you're going to hook or bonk on the head and put them in the freezer, but they're not designed for releasing trout or any other salmonids. You let a trout go from this net and you see there's huge runners of slime and scales dripping off because these knots scrape off the slime on the outside of the fish, and the slime and the scales are protection against fungus and parasites. And these are wild fish you're dealing with here that are going to go on and live for years afterwards. So wild steelhead go berserk when they're confined in a net, and letting them thrash around in the mesh of a cheap net like this is like throwing them into a cheese grater. Sure, the fish is alive when you release it, but for how long? What are the odds of that fish surviving long enough to spawn and then swim back out to the North Pacific and then come back and jump the falls and rapids and get back up to this lake again in a few years? So use a good net. In most lakes in BC, you'll be fishing for hatchery cloned fish, and there'll always be another hatchery truck dumping in thousands more, so the resource won't suffer if you kill a few fish because of a cheap net. But if you kill a few wild steelhead, there won't be anybody coming back to replace them. And you might be helping exterminate a fish run that has existed since the Ice Age. So if you don't have a good beach nearby or a good net, don't fish for wild steelhead. So we're going to be fishing with single barbless hook on a rod with a well-tested drag, and we'll be using a big soft net. I want to start with this clip, even though this is the tiniest steelhead I've ever seen in over 3 decades of fishing in this watershed. It's important to me because it shows the first fish I ever caught while recording with my GoPro camera. I was really struggling to learn how to run the GoPro. I had to make 3 trips deep into the mountains to shoot this little segment. On the first trip, there were no fish. On the second trip, there were lots of fish, but I absolutely could not get the GoPro to record. On the third trip, the weather was supposed to be showers, but it turned out to be steady rain when I got to the lake, and after this fish, it turned into a downpour. I caught 2 more much bigger fish, but I couldn't get the camera to record again. And then the downpour turned into a flood, and I had to wait a few days for the lake to settle down again before I went back. So here I am back at the lake a few days later. You can see that the weather has improved a little bit. I'm fishing from my customized electric pontoon boat with a tripod rack attached to hold my camera. Let's go fishing. On a day like this, it's a pleasure just to be out on this lake, fish or no fish. There's not another human being within sight or sound, just me and the ironheads, if they happen to show up for work today. The lure we're going to use today is an old standby, the Mepps spinner. This lure was invented by a French engineer named André Moulnard. Mepps is an acronym. It stands for Manufacturier d'engins de précision pour pêche sportive. In English, precision equipment for sport fishing. They make millions of Mepps spinners now in many different models. We're going to use the original, the Mepps Aglia. Here's a diagram of the patent application from 1938. Notice the shape of the blade. It hasn't changed after 3/4 of a century. We'll use it for nostalgia's sake, but also because it's a better spinner than any of the junk they've invented since. Most steelhead come back from the ocean to fresh water in late winter, so they're called winter run fish. But here we're looking for summer steelhead. It's February today, but the fish we're after may have left the salt water in September or July. That's why they're called summer run fish. They've been hanging around ever since in this lake or the river that flows through it, waiting for the right water conditions to spawn. There's nowhere near enough food in this lake to feed a pack of big steelhead. They probably haven't had a decent meal in 2 or 4 or even 6 months. So they're probably in the mood for a little snack. And if you drag something flashy in front of their nose, it's no wonder they'll try to eat it. When you hook these wild steelhead, they often swim right up to the boat without much resistance. Not like bass. It's almost like they want to check you out first before they decide what to do next. Then they start to scrap.
Mamma mia, that's a spicy meatball.
If I treat this fish with respect, I'll release it unharmed. It will go on to spawn in the river, and then it will swim back to the ocean, and it may be right back here again in a few years to bite on my lure. It's really shallow here. You can see the bottom. And the bottom here is littered with big sunken logs and root wads.
Wild steel.
I've been fishing this watershed for decades, so I may have caught and released this fish's parents, or grandparents, or great-grandparents. If the fish tangles around a log, it will break off right away. So I'm going to head out to deeper water and fight my fight out there. You can see that there's no beach anywhere nearby. No place to land a steelhead. That's why you need a net here. So I need to convince the fish to swim into the net. But there's a big problem. Wild steelhead don't like nets. They seem quite happy to swim round and round the boat, but when they see a net, they head the other way. And when they see the inside of a net, they freak out. That's when you can do serious damage to them with a cheap net. Most fishermen in BC will probably never see a wild summer steelhead. They were never as common as winter steelhead and never anywhere near as common as salmon. But the summer run fish have been almost exterminated by logging. They're like living dinosaurs, soon to vanish from the earth entirely if we don't change our attitude about resource management.
Does not like that net one bit.
There's hardly any habitat left on Vancouver Island that will support summer run fish like this. They're disappearing from the planet in direct inverse proportion to the profits of the logging industry and the general growth of the economy. That's how you get busted knuckles. From the point of view of a politician or a corporate manager, the past 100 years have been boom times on Vancouver Island. But from the point of view of most wild salmonids, it has been genocide. Ow! Another knuckle buster. My knuckles were bleeding by the end of this day.
That fish does not like that net. Just one look at that net. That fish doesn't. Come on, boy. This is 10-pound test to the max.
These wild steelhead have incredible stamina. This one just won't give up. Instead of swimming into the net, it has towed my whole boat back into shallow water. I'm going to try to lead the fish out deeper again. With a single barbless hook, the lure will come loose the instant there's any slack in the line. But if you lead them gently along with the electric motor, steelhead will almost always swim calmly right along beside the boat. Just don't try to lead them into a net. This is one of the stubbornest fish I've ever met. Almost as stubborn as me. We may have done business together 2 or 3 years ago. Now it's back, and so am I, and it just refuses to come aboard and pose for the Basstravaganza. The things that are threatening the future of these fish are often the same things that are threatening the future of humans on this planet. You have to respect any organism that fights for its freedom as hard as this fish does. It gives me inspiration to fight for my own freedom and persevere when things are tough. This colossal resource that once fed an entire culture that was so carefully nurtured and managed by aboriginals over thousands of years has been almost exterminated in the blink of an eye. And the summer steelhead are often the first to disappear because the habitat they depend on is so vulnerable to damage from clear-cut logging.
The runs are getting shorter.
I'm a bass fisherman and I'm not good at handling these big, strong fish. Even after a long battle, there's still a handful and very hard to get a hold of. The only way you could persuade this fish to sit still long enough to get a good picture would be to smack it on the head with a 2x4, and I'm not going to do that. So we will bid this fish adieu. Farewell, noble metalhead. Maybe we will meet again some other day, right on this very same spot, when we're both older and wiser. Well, that was an awesome fish. A lot of fishermen in BC will never catch a rainbow trout like that one in their entire lives. Let's give that spot a rest for a while and head down to spot B. If you're looking for steelhead in lakes, there has to be a stream running through the lake or there can't be any steelhead. And the best places to find them are usually near the inlet where the stream flows in or around the outlet where the stream flows out. So let's head down to the tail out and see if there are any more of those tin heads hanging around down there. You can see me slipping quietly down the tail out with my electric motor. Below you can see where the lake flows out into the river. I can't go down the river in my electric boat, so I want to hang out just above. There could be big steelhead cruising anywhere in this area, and you can see me throwing the MEPS, covering ground, searching for active fish. But there are none today until I get right down near the outlet where the lake drains out over a shallow gravel flat. This is like bone fishing in the Caribbean, chasing big fish in shallow, clear water. There's one now, another good fish, but it quickly thrashes on the surface and comes unbuttoned. The perils of single barbless. Watch the big MEPS come flying back at me as it pulls out of the fish's mouth. Welcome to the Basstravaganza. One way of dealing with this issue would be to put on a barbed hook, or worse than that, a barbed triple hook, or multiple barbed triple hooks. Another way is to have a sip of coffee, check your knot, and look for another hot fish. This trophy fishery should be closed to barbed hooks and triple hooks by regulation. I'm using up my casts here. Where there's one steelhead there are often two, but I have only one more area to cover before the lake ends, and I have to go look for another spot. So I throw down to the very bottom of the tail out, and there's another good mykiss. And another shout out to Andre Mulnard and his wonderful invention. Any one of these big metalheads could peel all the line off my reel and break me off if they headed down out of the lake into the river current. But they never do. They always head up toward the deep sanctuary of the lake. They don't want to be in the shallows, and neither do I, because there are lots of trees and logs sticking out from shore. If the fish tangles into a sunken log, it will surely break me off, so I want to lead it out to a place away from shore that's deeper. It looks like I'm towing this fish with my electric motor, but I'm not. You see that my little rod, which is way too wimpy for steelhead by most people's standards, is hardly bending. I'm actually racing to stay ahead of the fish, and trying to lead it away from shore and steer it into the middle of the channel whenever I can. Now I'm where I want to be, so I kill the motor and start to reel in the line that I've paid out. Just like the first fish today, this one swims calmly along until it sees my pontoons. Then it changes its plan quick. It's over 30 feet deep here, and this fish nose dives straight down and burns 30 feet of line off my drag in seconds. Then it roams around the lake bottom beneath my boat. At this stage, with 10-pound line,
That's a nice one. Like the other one.
there's nothing more you can do than hold on and hope that the fish doesn't snag off on a log or a stump or a boulder.
This one's not so placed. Now you start. Now you're reaching water. What a bug.
It's so sad to me that these magnificent wild fish might be extinct before I am. There used to be hundreds of steelhead in this system. Now there may be only a few dozen. There used to be thousands of salmon passing through this lake every year. Now only hundreds, if that.
Oh, yeah, be a movie star. Hollywood is calling. I can't reach much harder. My arm's gonna fall off.
Well, if my arm doesn't fall off first, I'm going to have two nice fish in the net. And this is just my second attempt at filming steelhead fishing with a GoPro. The weather's sure a lot better this time, and I'm finally starting to learn how to turn this dinky little camera on and off. On future episodes of the Basstravaganza, I'm going to show more video from this watershed and more spectacular wild fish. But for now, let's get this bad boy into the net. Notice that the single barbless hook often falls out as soon as there's no tension on the line. You don't even have to remove it. This time it removes itself. Well, my first full day of GoPro metalhead hunting has gone fairly well. I'm feeling pretty cocky, so after lunch I decide to head back to the tail out for one more fish. But this time I'm going to call my shot. You can see me giving a demo of the big meps I'm throwing. And then I point to the spot on my pitiful little rod where it broke in half from old age, and I patched it back together by gluing a piece of another rod over the break. That's a rod that's truly broken in. Now I elaborate on my plan in greater detail. It's pretty simple. Keep quiet and keep throwing that meps around until a fish bites on it. You can see by where I'm pointing that I have a suspicion of where that fish might be, right where its buddies were hanging out a couple hours ago. I'm just about to line up on my spot when I almost come to grief. Somebody parked a tree right in the way of my boat. It's too bad that you can't fast forward through all the blank casts in real life. You people out there in video land are so lucky. Now, how often can you point to your spot on camera and then go there and bust a wild summer steelhead live on video? Welcome to the Basstravaganza. we are incorporated once again and back in business. You can see that I'm speeding this up because we're getting to the end of this episode, but it's too late. We've run out of time again. Well, be sure to stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.